They said that in the dark nights of Mexico City during the 1920s, when priests were hunted like criminals and the faithful met in whispered shadows, a mysterious figure sometimes slipped through the alleyways. Sometimes he was a mechanic with greasy hands and a flat cap. Sometimes he was a businessman in a clean gray suit. Sometimes he was a beggar with dusty sandals and a torn shirt. But in every disguise, behind every mask, his eyes shone with the same unmistakable flame, joy, mischief, courage, and a love for God that no earthly force could terrify or tame. Those who encountered him would sometimes swear years later that they had sensed something supernatural in his presence, like they were meeting a man who walked with angels, who lived halfway between earth and heaven. Others remembered something simpler, his laughter, his glorious, irrepressible laughter, the laughter of someone who knew he could be killed any day, yet carried within him a peace the world could not give. The world would eventually know him as Blessed Miguel Agustín Pro. But his story did not begin in revolution, disguises, or firing squads. It began in a quiet provincial town, under the warm Mexican sun, with a boy who could never quite stop joking. Miguel was born on January 13th, 1891, in Guadalupe, Zacatecas, into a devout, affectionate, bustling family. He was one of many siblings, and the Pro household always seemed filled with movement, doors swinging open, children chasing each other through the courtyard, the smell of tortillas drifting from the kitchen, and his father's warm voice echoing through the rooms as he returned from his work in the mining industry. Unlike many priestly figures who grew up solemn and studious, Miguel was a whirlwind of humor even as a child. He was mischievous, easily delighted, quick to tease, and known in the neighborhood for playing harmless pranks that made adults shake their heads while trying not to laugh. But beneath that cheerful personality lay something quietly forming, a tender conscience and an instinctive compassion. One of his earliest memories, retold later by his siblings, was of him slipping his own candy into the hands of a crying poor child outside the local church. He didn't tell anyone. He simply did it and ran off. He had inherited, from his deeply spiritual mother, a heart that could not stand to see suffering without wanting to soothe it. His adolescence was a mixture of comedy and devotion. There were the usual antics. Once, for instance, he climbed onto the house roof to mimic a rooster at dawn, waking the entire neighborhood in disbelief and amusement. But there were also quieter moments, lingering too long in the church after Mass, staring at the flickering candles, gazing at the crucifix with soft, unspoken yearning, writing small prayers in the margins of his school notebooks. His siblings remembered that he sometimes went silent without warning, as though hearing something they could not. It was not the silence of sadness. It was the silence of someone being called. One evening, when he was about 15, he experienced something he never fully described aloud. He had slipped into the church after sunset, when only a dim lamp burned near the altar. He knelt in the pew, thinking of nothing in particular. And then, as he later wrote in a private note preserved by his sisters, something stirred within him. A warmth, a presence that seemed to rise from the tabernacle itself. It washed over him, filled him, and brought tears to his eyes. He wrote that he felt held, known, and loved. It lasted only a few moments, and then the stillness returned. But he left the church that night changed. A thread had been tied between his soul and God, and it would never break. Yet he did not immediately understand it as a call to priesthood. He tried to ignore it. He buried himself in family life, friendships, schoolwork, humor. He entertained thoughts about becoming an engineer, perhaps joining his father's work. He dreamed of travel, adventures, and maybe even romance, though in truth he was shy around girls despite his outward confidence. But that thread tugged at him again and again. By the time he reached his late teens, the tugging became unmistakable. Then came the moment of clarity, simple, almost ordinary, but decisive. He had accompanied his sisters to a parish retreat, not to participate seriously, but mostly to spend time with them and enjoy the peaceful atmosphere. On the second evening, while a priest preached about Christ's sacrifice and the courage of early Christian martyrs, Miguel felt that presence again. It rose within him like a quiet whisper. "Come, follow me." He closed his eyes, and in his heart, he said yes. The decision shocked some who knew him. His humor, his playfulness, his love of life, none of it seemed like the temperament of a Jesuit. But for others, it made sense. The boy who joked the loudest also prayed with the deepest sincerity. His courage, his empathy, his ability to read hearts, all were signs of a priestly soul. He entered the Jesuit novitiate in El Llano, Michoacan. In 1911, at the age of 20, the world around him was beginning to shift. The Mexican Revolution was unfolding. Government suspicion of the church was growing. Priests were already being threatened in some regions. Yet Miguel felt no fear. On the day he left home, he hugged each of his siblings, cracked a joke about how they should pray the rosary extra hard for him so he wouldn't get kicked out for being too loud, and walked away with that bright, infectious grin. But the novitiate would test him. Jesuit life was strict, discipline, silence, study, obedience. For someone as naturally energetic and humorous as Miguel, these early years were both purifying and humbling. He learned to control his impulse to speak at every moment. He learned to turn his humor into a tool of warmth rather than distraction. Yet his joy remained. Even the sternest superiors could not help but appreciate him. They said that wherever he went, the entire atmosphere brightened. During these years, he deepened his prayer life intensely. Long hours of silent meditation left their mark. In one private journal entry, he wrote that at times during prayer, he felt as though Christ himself drew near, with a gentleness strong enough to break a heart. He confided to a fellow novice that he sometimes sensed an unseen presence walking beside him during morning meditation walks, a presence he believed to be his guardian angel. Whether mystical or simply the fruit of deep contemplation, these moments strengthened him for the trials that lay ahead. But those trials came sooner than expected. In 1914, persecution against the church intensified, and the Jesuit novitiate was shut down by anti-clerical forces. The young Jesuits were forced to flee, quietly, secretly, often at night. It was the first time Miguel tasted danger for the sake of his calling, but not the last. He and his companions made their way north, crossing through unfamiliar towns, sometimes hiding in private homes, sometimes traveling disguised as ordinary workers. It was a foreshadowing of the life he would one day lead in Mexico City, slipping past authorities, moving unseen, trusting only God and his quick wit. Eventually, he escaped the unrest by leaving Mexico entirely. The Jesuits sent him to study abroad, first in the United States and then in Spain. His journey to Spain was difficult. He suffered seasickness, loneliness, and, for the first time, the shock of being far from his beloved family and homeland. He wrote home constantly, filling his letters with jokes, drawings, and affectionate teasing. Yet beneath the humor, his siblings sensed a growing depth. His letters spoke of long hours of prayer, struggles with homesickness, and moments where the Eucharist gave him a peace nothing else could. His health, however, began to deteriorate. Severe stomach problems plagued him. There were days he doubled over in pain, unable to eat, unable to concentrate on his studies. Doctors could not find a lasting cure. At times, he feared he would be dismissed from the society due to illness. But he fought on, clinging to his vocation with the tenacity of someone who had given his entire existence to God. "If my life is to be short," he once told a fellow seminarian, "then let it be full." His health battles forged something in him, an inner toughness, a deeper humility, a reliance on grace rather than his natural energy. And yet, even in sickness, his sense of humor never faltered. His classmates recalled how he would turn a moment of pain into a joke, how he would imitate his doctor's serious expressions, how he made entire rooms laugh despite barely being able to stand. Even in Spain, far from Mexico, he felt the growing storm back home. The Mexican government was intensifying its war on the church, closing seminaries, expelling priests, desecrating churches. Letters from home were filled with distress and fear. Miguel read them with a heavy heart, knowing that someday he would return to the very center of that storm. But not yet. God was still preparing him. By the time he was ordained in 1925 in Belgium, after years of study, sickness, exile, prayer, and purification, the mischievous boy from Zacatecas had become a priest whose soul was both gentle and steel-strong. On the day of his first Mass, he wept as he held the consecrated host. He later wrote, "My entire life, all of it, belongs to Christ now." He did not fully know what that would mean, but heaven did. His journey home was coming. When Father Miguel Pro finally stepped back onto Mexican soil in 1926, it was not the triumphant homecoming he had once imagined. There were no parish bells ringing, no crowds greeting him, no procession welcoming a newly ordained priest back to his homeland. Instead, he slipped quietly into the country like a criminal crossing the border. The anti-Catholic crackdown under President Plutarco Calles had escalated into full government persecution. Churches were closed. Public worship was banned. Priests were hunted. And now Miguel was returning into the heart of the storm. His family received him secretly. They hugged him tightly, marveling at how thin he had become from years of illness, yet how bright his eyes were with joy. His mother wept into his cassock, whispering, "Thank God you are home." But Miguel simply laughed softly and told her she had not aged a day, an obvious lie, but one she cherished. The very next morning, he disguised himself for the first time. He had barely eaten breakfast when a message came from a woman in the neighborhood whose father was dying and needed the last sacraments. The streets were crawling with informants. Priests were arrested on sight. Miguel stood, walked his room, and emerged moments later dressed like a humble mechanic, cap pulled low, sleeves rolled up, dust smeared on his face. In his pocket, he had a tiny oil stock for anointing. His mother looked at him and said nothing. She understood. He winked at her, stepped out the door, and vanished into the sunlit street. Thus began the most extraordinary chapter of his life. Each day brought new disguises, new missions, new dangers. He transformed himself with an actor's instinct and a saint's courage. A street vendor selling tamales, a businessman with a briefcase, a police officer with forged papers, even a beggar limping down the alleyways with a wooden cane. But beneath the costumes, he was always the same, a shepherd searching for his scattered sheep. One of his first dramatic episodes occurred only weeks after his return. Late one evening, a young woman knocked urgently at the Pro family's door. Her brother had been arrested and was being held in a government building known for torture. She begged Miguel to help, though she did not know what help meant in such times. He listened quietly, nodded once, and left without hesitation. Hours later he returned, exhausted but triumphant. Somehow, no one ever learned exactly how, he had walked straight into the building disguised as a lawyer, spoken to the guards with such confidence that they never questioned him, found a young man, and arranged for his release. When asked how he pulled it off, Miguel just shrugged playfully and said, "They were very polite. I think they liked my tie." But his courage went deeper than cleverness. In those early months, Mexico City became a labyrinth of secret chapels. Families who risked everything would open their homes to clandestine masses. Curtains were drawn. Windows were covered. Children were told to cough or play a small instrument if soldiers approached. And in those hidden rooms, with furniture pushed aside and candles trembling in the darkness, Miguel would celebrate the Eucharist. Those who attended never forgot it. His voice was soft yet steady. His homilies carried a warmth that made the frightened faithful feel, for a moment, like they were safe. But above all, they remembered his eyes, alive with a joy that persecution could not extinguish. They said that when he elevated the host, He looked like a man seeing Christ himself standing before him. One night, in a cramped living room on a quiet street, something extraordinary happened. A woman suffering from a long illness had been carried into the makeshift chapel by her relatives. She could barely breathe. Miguel paused the Mass briefly to pray over her, laying his hand lightly on her forehead. No one expected much. He prayed quietly, simply without theatrics. But the woman later testified that she felt a sudden warmth radiate from his hand, then through her entire body. When she stood up moments later, unaided, steady, astonished, the room fell silent. Her breathing was normal. Her pain had vanished. Her family wept. Miguel only smiled and whispered, "Thank him, not me." That was not the only time such things occurred. Another night, he visited a small shack where a mother sat beside her dying infant. The baby's skin was pale. Its heartbeat was faint. The mother's tears fell onto the child's blanket. Miguel knelt beside them, made the sign of the cross over the infant, and prayed with such tenderness that even the father, hardened by poverty, began to cry. When the child suddenly stirred, opened its eyes, and began to cry with strength, the mother gasped. Miguel kissed the baby's forehead and quietly slipped away into the night. But with every miracle came greater danger. The government intensified its surveillance. Spies whispered in cafes. Neighbors betrayed neighbors. Soldiers raided homes. Bulletins were posted offering rewards for information, leading to the capture of priests. Miguel found himself hunted. Still, he refused to hide. He went wherever he was needed, no matter the risk. He climbed back alley staircases to bless marriages. He slipped into courtyards to hear confessions under trees. He crawled through narrow windows to anoint the sick. He performed baptisms at night, with only moonlight illuminating the water. And everywhere he went, he brought laughter. Even in the presence of the dying, he found gentle ways to lift hearts. "I think God loves joy," he once told a frightened young man preparing for a secret confirmation. "It disarms the devil." But the tension surrounding him grew as the Calles law tightened its grip. Police checkpoints increased. Raids became frequent. And Miguel's disguises, no matter how creative, could not guarantee his safety forever. One incident etched itself permanently into the memory of those close to him. A young man named Antonio, barely 20, had been badly wounded during a government raid. The Pro family offered refuge. Miguel spent 2 days nursing him, praying with him, telling him humorous stories to distract him from the pain. But late on the third night, soldiers surrounded the street. Searches were underway. The family panicked. Antonio would be found, and so would Miguel. Without hesitation, Miguel helped move the wounded man into a hidden space behind a false wall in the house. But as they concealed the opening, Miguel heard boots outside. Soldiers approached, knocking on doors, shouting orders. The Pro family looked at him with fear, but he only smiled softly. "I'll talk to them," he whispered. He walked calmly to the front door and opened it. 3 soldiers stood there, rifles ready. Their leader demanded to search the home. Miguel leaned casually against the doorframe, wearing an apron and holding a bucket of water, as though he had been cleaning. He let out a theatrical sigh and said, "Can't you come back later? My mother will scold me if you track dirt in again." The absurdity of his tone startled the soldiers. They stared at him, confused. The leader hesitated, then grunted, and ordered 2 men to sweep the outside perimeter instead. They left without entering the house. When the door shut, the Pro family collapsed in silent relief. It would become one of his most legendary escapes. But his work was not merely heroic. It was profoundly pastoral. He never forgot that his mission was souls. In moments of prayer, especially during the night, he would kneel before a small crucifix and whisper, "Take everything, Lord, even my life, if it will save them." His prayer life grew more intense as the danger around him increased. He confided to one of his sisters that he sometimes sensed a supernatural consolation during his missions, as though a hand rests on my shoulder when I enter a home in fear. He described dreams in which Christ walked ahead of him through the alleys of Mexico City, beckoning him to follow without fear. These mystical reassurances strengthened him for the months that lay ahead. By late 1926, the persecution was reaching its peak. The government sought to crush every remnant of Catholic life. Entire neighborhoods were being searched for priests. And one night, Miguel faced a chase unlike any he had experienced. He was traveling to bring communion to a group of women who had risked everything to maintain a small devotional circle. To reach them, he disguised himself as a well-dressed businessman. The host was hidden in a small pouch inside his coat. But as he turned down a street, he saw a patrol approaching. 2 soldiers looked directly at him with suspicion. He walked faster. They called after him. He did not look back. Then the footsteps quickened. They shouted a command. He ran. The cobblestones echoed under his feet. Shouts filled the alleyways. Soldiers were gaining. He ducked into a narrow passage between 2 buildings, brushed aside a wooden crate, and squeezed through a gap barely wide enough for his body. The soldiers passed without noticing. For several minutes he stood in total darkness, chest heaving, the Eucharist pressed against his heart. In that cold silence he whispered, "My Jesus, what a chase for a thief like me." Then he laughed softly in the shadows. When the streets quieted, he slipped out and made his way to the waiting women. They never knew the danger he had escaped only minutes earlier, but the danger was closing in, and soon the government would target him directly. The storm was coming. The longer Father Miguel Pro worked in the shadows of Mexico City, the more he became a legend among the faithful and a target among the authorities. His name passed quietly from house to house, whispered like a prayer. Padre Miguel can help. Padre Miguel can hear your confession. Padre Miguel can bring communion. Families who had not seen a priest in months would weep when he entered their homes disguised as a laborer or merchant. Yet as his ministry expanded, danger closed in. By late 1927, the government's persecution machine had grown ruthless. Informants lurked at street corners. Neighbors betrayed one another. Priests vanished. Soldiers raided entire blocks without warning, dragging away anyone suspected of harboring clergy. Newspapers printed triumphant announcements of captured religious criminals. And the name Miguel Pro, though never printed, circulated among law enforcement as a particularly elusive target. The police had heard of him. The Jesuit with many disguises. The priest who dressed like a beggar one night, and a wealthy gentleman the next. The man who slipped out of houses moments before raids. The ghost of Mexico City's underground church. And as the government's grip tightened, Miguel's work grew even more urgent. One cold night in early autumn, he received word that a group of workers in a factory district had been arrested after soldiers discovered a hidden rosary circle. 2 young women escaped capture and were hiding in an abandoned workshop. They sent a message asking for confession. They feared they might be found before dawn. Miguel disguised himself as a delivery driver, complete with a dusty cap and a torn jacket. He carried a small sack of bread to avoid suspicion. The streets were tense. Soldiers stood at corners with rifles slung across their chests. Patrols marched in slow, heavy steps. But Miguel's pace remained relaxed, almost cheerful. He reached the workshop and stepped inside. 2 young women huddled in the darkness, their faces pale, their hands trembling. When they recognized him, they fell to their knees, weeping with relief. He knelt with them, offering words so gentle that fear seemed to melt from the air. After they confessed, he gave them a blessing. One of them whispered, "Father, how are you not afraid?" Miguel smiled, touching her shoulder. "If God wants my life, he may take it. Until then, I am quite safe." He left them with instructions for escaping the city at dawn. Hours later, soldiers raided the district. The women, following Miguel's guidance, slipped away at first light and survived. But that night's calm was the last peace Miguel would know for some time. In early November, a plot unfolded that would set the trap for him. The government claimed that an attempt had been made on the life of the former president, Álvaro Obregón. The bomb used in the attack was reportedly linked to a group of Catholic youths, including a man named Luis Segura, whom Miguel had ministered to months earlier. The accusation was false, the evidence fabricated, but the government seized the moment. They issued a secret order. Father Miguel Pro must be arrested, not for evidence, not for proof, but because his influence had grown too powerful, too dangerous. The underground Catholic resistance, though peaceful, had become a symbol of defiance. Miguel, by his kindness and charisma, had become one of its brightest lights. Now the state wanted that light extinguished. The police began watching his family. They followed his siblings. They monitored the Pro home. Plainclothes agents loitered near the street corners, pretending to chat with neighbors. Miguel sensed a shift at once. One evening, as he returned from bringing communion to a group of widows, he noticed a shadow detach itself from a wall and follow him. He slowed. The shadow slowed. He turned a corner sharply. The shadow followed. He ducked into a courtyard and pressed himself behind a column just as a man in a coat stepped in, searching the darkness. The man took several steps, scanning the shadows, but something made him hesitate. He turned away and left. Miguel exhaled softly, placed a hand on his crucifix, and whispered, "Into your hands." But the pressure grew. He heard from friends that the government was gathering lists of suspected priests. Rumors spread that a major crackdown was coming. Some urged him to flee Mexico City. Others begged him to go into deeper hiding. He refused. "If they want me," he told his sisters, "I will not make them chase me across the world. God placed me here. He will take me from here." Yet even as he said this, he knew the net was tightening. One of the most dramatic moments of his final weeks occurred when he set out to bring communion to a sick man living near a government barracks. The man's wife had sent an urgent message. Her husband was failing fast. Miguel disguised himself as a paper vendor, carrying a bundle of old newspapers and a small hidden pyx containing the Eucharist. As he approached the house, he saw soldiers loading rifles outside the barracks. He crossed the street calmly, head down, but a sergeant called out to him, "You, paper seller, come here." Miguel stiffened slightly, but turned with a polite smile. "Sí, señor." The sergeant ordered him to hand over a newspaper. Miguel did so. The sergeant unfolded it, then frowned. The paper was from last month. "Why are you selling old papers?" Miguel chuckled lightly. "Because the news is so bad these days, senor, I thought people might prefer yesterday." The soldiers burst into laughter. The sergeant shook his head, waved him away, and muttered, "Crazy vendor." Miguel bowed theatrically and continued on his way. Once he turned the corner, he pressed a hand to his chest, his heart racing, and whispered a prayer of thanks. Inside the sick man's home, he anointed him, heard his confession, and placed the host on his tongue. The man died peacefully only hours later. The spiritual weight of these missions began shaping Miguel's inner life profoundly. In his private moments, he prayed with increasing intensity. His nights became long vigils. He often knelt for hours before a small crucifix in the Pro family home, sometimes praying until dawn. His sisters recalled hearing him whispering prayers with tenderness, so deep it sounded like a conversation with someone visible only to him. One night, his sister witnessed something she never forgot. She woke to get water and saw faint candlelight under the door of the small room where Miguel prayed. Curious, She peeked inside. He was kneeling with his hands open, tears streaming down his cheeks. His face glowed with a strange peace. But it was his posture that struck her, leaning slightly forward as though listening. She said later, it looked like someone was speaking to him. Whether mystical grace or the depth of his communion with God, something was happening within him, a quiet preparation, a strengthening, a surrender. But no grace could stop the gears of the state. On November 13th, undercover agents followed his brother Umberto, hoping he would lead them to Miguel. That evening, as the Pro brothers returned home, agents swarmed them. Umberto was seized. Miguel, too, was arrested, though without resistance. The soldiers bound his wrists, but he smiled gently at them, almost consoling, as though they were the ones being led to danger. He joked lightly, "Be careful with those ropes, muchachos. I bruised easily in seminary." Even the arresting officer looked startled by his calmness. They brought the Pro brothers to a government building for questioning. But questioning was a formality. The government had no intention of offering a trial, no desire for evidence, no patience for legal procedures. Father Miguel Pro was already condemned. Yet in those first hours of captivity, a strange serenity surrounded him. He prayed constantly. He asked for nothing except a few minutes of silence. He whispered the rosary on his fingers. He forgave his captors in his heart. When the guards mocked him, he smiled kindly. When they cursed the church, he bowed his head gently. More than once, a guard later confessed, he looked like he was praying for us. On the third night of imprisonment, Miguel felt a sudden peace settle over him, a peace he later described as a grace from our Lord, sweeter than life. He sensed that the end was approaching. He welcomed it. He wrote a brief note to his family. "Do not worry about me. My heart is very calm. God's will is everything." But he did not know that the government had already made a decision that would shock the world. They would execute him, and they would photograph it for the newspapers, not to prove guilt, but to crush the spirit of the Catholic people. They did not understand what they were unleashing, for heaven had been preparing Miguel's entire life for this moment. The night before his execution was strangely quiet. In the high-walled courtyard of the police headquarters, the wind rustled against the iron bars like a distant whisper. Guards paced with heavy boots, their rifles slung across their shoulders. Inside his cell, Father Miguel Pro knelt on the stone floor, his fingers loosely intertwined around a small wooden crucifix he had carried since his ordination. The dim lantern above him flickered, casting shadows that seemed to sway like silent angels. He prayed not for deliverance, nor for a miracle, nor even for justice. He prayed for Mexico. He prayed for the persecuted faithful hiding in dark homes across the city. He prayed for the guards who watched him with suspicion by day and unease by night. And above all, he prayed for the courage to die with love, not anger, in his heart. He had been told nothing, but he sensed what was coming. A priest knows when the hour approaches. And Miguel, ever sharp, ever perceptive, recognized the stillness that settles on a condemned man's soul. Around midnight, a guard brought him a cup of water. Miguel looked up, smiled warmly, and said, "Thank you, hijo. May God reward you." The guard hesitated before handing over the cup, as though uncertain how to interact with someone who should have been trembling with fear, but was instead radiating calm. Later, the man would whisper to another soldier, he had the peace of someone who was already in heaven. When the footsteps of the guards receded, Miguel pressed a crucifix to his forehead. In the quiet of that cell, he felt a sudden warmth, gentle, enveloping, settle over him. It was not physical, yet unmistakably real. It came like an embrace, filling him with serenity beyond anything he had experienced, even in prayer. He whispered, barely audible, "Señor, stay with me." He did not sleep that night. At dawn, the world seemed inexplicably calm. A thin veil of fog lingered over the courtyard. Soldiers moved with stiff motions, as if aware that they would soon perform a task from which the soul recoils. A photographer from the government newspaper arrived, carrying a bulky camera and wearing a grim expression. He had been ordered to record the execution, proof of the regime's power. But he would later say that from the moment he entered, he felt as though he was walking on holy ground. Shortly after sunrise, guards approached Miguel's cell. He stood the moment they arrived. He had been praying, but he rose with the energy of someone fully awake, fully willing. One guard cleared his throat and announced, "We're taking you now." Miguel nodded gently. "I am ready." As they led him through the hallway, he saw his brothers, Umberto and Roberto, also under arrest. They stood near the entrance of another cell, pale and frightened. Miguel reached out, touched Umberto's shoulder, and said with a light, cheerful tone, as though they were children again, "Animo, hermano, we will see each other soon." Umberto burst into tears. Miguel simply squeezed his arm and said, "Courage! God is with us." He walked through the courtyard with the serene stride of a man going to a place he had awaited his whole life. Soldiers watched him with bewildered expressions. Some murmured prayers under their breath. One, visibly shaken, made the sign of the cross as Miguel passed. In the center of the execution yard stood a small wooden post, weathered and cracked. The photographer adjusted his tripod nervously. A colonel shouted orders, but his voice wavered. Everything about the scene felt tense, unnatural, as though the world itself anticipated what would unfold. But Miguel was radiant. He asked the soldiers, "May I pray a moment?" The colonel hesitated, then nodded. Miguel knelt on the dirt, kissed the crucifix, and whispered, "My Lord and my King, give me strength to die for you." He remained silent for several breaths, eyes closed, face lifted slightly, like a man listening to a voice only he could hear. When he rose, a guard stepped forward to blindfold him. Miguel shook his head gently. "No, let me face you." The guard faltered, lowered the cloth, and stepped back. There was something irresistible in Miguel's gaze, courage without arrogance, peace without submission, love without fear. He then stretched out his arms wide, like a living crucifix. He stood tall, his cassock rustling in the breeze, a faint smile softening his face. The soldiers raised their rifles. The photographer adjusted the lens. The colonel barked orders, though his voice cracked. Miguel drew one last breath and shouted with a voice that echoed off every stone in the courtyard, "Viva Cristo Rey! Long live Christ the King!" The words rang through the air like thunder. Some soldiers trembled. Others froze in awe. A few later admitted that at that moment they felt something grip their hearts. Something holy. The colonel gave a command. A volley of rifle shots tore through the courtyard. Of all the images captured that day, the one burned into history is a moment just before the bullet struck, Miguel's arms outstretched, his eyes fixed on heaven, his lips still open from proclaiming Christ. He fell to the ground, collapsing gently, as though into the arms of angels. But the government, fearing rumors of survival, ordered a final shot fired at close range. A soldier stepped forward, lifted his pistol, and aimed directly at Miguel's heart. The photographer snapped another image. The soldier pulled the trigger, and with that final shot, Miguel's earthly life ended. But death did not silence him. Word of the execution spread through Mexico City like wildfire. Though the government intended the newspaper photos to intimidate the population, the effect was the opposite. People wept openly in the streets. Mothers held the image of the outstretched arm priest to their hearts. Young men whispered, "If he can die for Christ, so can we." Old women lit candles and placed them under his image as though venerating a relic. The phrase "Viva Cristo Rey" became the anthem of the persecuted faithful. The Pro family was given permission to retrieve the body. When his mother saw him, she knelt beside him and kissed his cold forehead. She did not scream or collapse. She simply whispered, "Dios te bendiga, hijo. God bless you, my son." His sisters washed his wounds tenderly, weeping quietly. His brother held his hand and whispered, "You are always brave." Even as a boy, thousands of people, despite the danger, lined the streets for the funeral procession. The government forbade public expressions of faith, yet an unbroken column of mourners trailed behind the Pro family. Many carried rosaries openly, daring the soldiers to stop them. Women sang hymns softly. Men whispered prayers. Children gazed at the coffin with awe. The government attempted to block the procession. The people pushed past them. They attempted to confiscate the photographs. The people hid them in their clothing and reproduced them secretly. They attempted to silence his legacy. His final words became the cry of the Cristero resistance. And long after the Calles law faded, long after the terror subsided, the image of Father Miguel Pro, arms outstretched, eyes shining, lips forming the words, "Viva Cristo Rey," remained etched in the soul of Mexican Catholicism. For decades, pilgrims visited the place of his martyrdom. Families kept copies of the execution photo in their homes as a sign of courage. Priests invoked his name when facing persecution. And generations of Mexican Catholics grew up hearing stories of the laughing Jesuit who defied a government with nothing but disguises, miracles, and overwhelming love. In 1988, Pope St. John Paul II beatified him, declaring him a martyr killed in hatred of the faith. During the ceremony, the Pope spoke of Miguel's joy, courage, and humor, and held up the execution photo, still haunting, still powerful, as a reminder that love is stronger than death. But his legacy is not confined to history books or photographs. It lives in the hearts of those who whisper prayers in secret. It lives in the courage of those who suffer for their faith. It lives in the laughter of those who choose joy in the midst of fear. It lives in every soul who hears a story and feels their own courage rise. For Father Miguel Pro did not die merely as a victim of injustice. He died as a lover of Christ. He died with outstretched arms, like a savior. He died with a cry on his lips that still echoes across the world. Viva Cristo Rey!